So this is Freedom of Speech in the Arts, Voices from the Left. My name is Carmen Aguirre, theater artist and author, and the organizer and moderator of this panel. My preferred pronouns are she, her, hers. Just a couple of housekeeping things. The washrooms are right out there, and they are gender neutral. The fire exit is right here, where I'm pointing. I have organized this event on my own, and yet it is a village of friends and colleagues who have helped make it happen. First of all, deepest gratitude to Bard on the Beach for donating this space. Thank you to a donor who wishes to remain anonymous, other than to say that she is an Argentinian feminist who put her life on the line in Argentina fighting for justice and equality for all. Her generous donation covered all of tonight's costs, including liability insurance and equipment rental. Thank you to Daphne, yes. Thank you to Daphne Blanco Sarlay for designing the graphic for tonight's event and creating the Facebook event page because I am technologically challenged. Scott Bellis, Heidi Taylor, Kathleen Flaherty, Manami Hara, Kata Dewick, Lena Dewick, AJ Simmons, Elaine Avila, Emilia Symington Fetty, Itai Erdal, Rafi Spivak, Francisco Trujillo, Cindy Angel, Michael Red, Maria Zarillo, and Stacy Menzies for volunteering time, equipment, and resources. Sandra Swasnabar Alberco is a counselor. So, Sandra, can you stand up and show us where you are? There she is. She's a counselor. And she, too, is donating her time and is available should anybody need support. Sandra is a certified expressive arts therapist, originally from Lima, Peru. She has been working in nonprofit, social justice, and anti-violence agencies serving diverse communities. Over the last 10 years, Sandra has been involved in direct support, advocacy, community therapy, as well as leadership. Sandra draws from her lived experience as a queer Indigenous woman and as a migrant. She applies intersectional feminism, trauma-informed, and anti-oppressive approaches to her daily interactions and in her practice as an expressive arts therapist. Again, she is available should anyone need support. Just go up to her or wave her over, and you can go to the green room, which is outside, and talk over there. And of course, I would like to thank each of our panelists. Samir Gandesha, if you can raise your hand. Micheal Vonn. Morgane Oger. Morgane Oger. Sky Gilbert. And Omari Newton, who's way over there on that. He is joining us via Skype from Montreal. They are all donating their time to this conversation. So just so everybody knows, we are live streaming tonight. SFU School for the Humanities is also filming in order to share the link on the SFU website. And Co-op Radio's Red Eye program is recording the event to be played on the radio at a future date. I would like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded Coast Salish territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, where stories have been told and debates and dialogue have been had for thousands of years. So this is what inspired me to bring these panelists together and those who wish to hear them. The tension between upcoming Freedom to Read Week, which encourages Canadians to reaffirm their commitment to intellectual freedom, guaranteed under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the cancellation of the public reading of Sky Gilbert's play, Drag Queens in Outer Space, to have taken place in November 2018. Buddies in Bad Times Theatre canceled the reading after Sky published a poem on his blog entitled, I'm Afraid of Woke People, in response to Vivek Shreya's book, I'm Afraid of Men. Vivek declined an invitation to join this panel. Sky's poem, in response to her book, was experienced as transphobic by some members of the community. The protest over the poem was such that Buddies held a long table instead of the reading of his play. The long table was informative, necessary, and important. The question asked by several people beforehand was, why not have both? The reading on one night with those against it simply not attending, and the long table on another. Sky is a former artistic director of Buddies in Bad Times and a fierce protector of free speech during his decade-long leadership of that organization. The tension between Freedom to Read Week and the cancellation of Sky's reading are not happening in a vacuum, but within a much larger conjuncture in our current public discourse, within the context of a call-out culture that takes place mostly online, a culture of mobbing, shunning, and deplatforming, which is the practice of shutting down access to the platform from which objectionable views can be espoused, affecting academia and the arts world. Work is judged and its author punished based on the anti-intellectual, anti-political binary of emotional safety versus emotional danger. Today's discussion will center around these phenomena happening within the left. We are in a censorious climate that leads to self-censorship and to an inability to recognize our own allies, knowing that an ally doesn't have to agree with everything I say. As a person who spent my youth living under extreme right-wing dictatorships and fighting them in South America, this climate is worrisome to me. I'm also here tonight as someone who vocally supported Andrea Dworkin's 1980s stance to censor all pornography because it was harmful to women. As a teen who had recently been raped at gunpoint, it was my pain and trauma speaking when I favored censorship. I no longer hold those beliefs. I now believe that if I experience porn as harmful, then I simply won't watch it, as opposed to demanding that all others bow down to my position or labeling those who do consume porn as misogynists. Let us remember that Dworkin, a radical feminist, was in line with Canada Customs when they seized queer pornography at the border on the grounds of it being obscene, stopping it from entering the country to Little Sisters bookstore. That case was won by Little Sisters in the Supreme Court, defended by the BC Civil Liberties Association, of which Micheal Vonn is the policy director. That was also in the 80s. The 80s is when Salman Rushdie's novel, The Satanic Verses, was accused of blasphemy by some fundamentalist members of the Muslim community. A fatwa was put against his life. He went into hiding for a decade. Let us not forget the historical context in which we are operating. I was saying that our current conjuncture is worrisome to me because I fear that we are heading into a type of fundamentalism or Puritanism or orthodoxy. This is scary for those of us who work in the arts. Art is meant to serve, but of even greater importance to disturb. Artists are expected to take risks, to fail, to get it wrong. And these risks are taken in public. That is the nature of being an artist. Today we will be focusing on the tension between an artist's right and responsibility to transgress and fellow artists' offense. I am aware that there are consequences to exercising freedom of speech, but should the consequences be the shutting down of work that we don't agree with, that we find offensive or even harmful? The urgency of this conversation became apparent to me when I concluded that I would organize this event on my own. Those I approached to co-organize it with me expressed fear about the framing of the topic and about who would be on the panel. It is telling that the topic of freedom of speech / hate speech / creative censorship is met with trepidation, and that there were immediate requests to control who would be allowed to speak. I am reminded of how urgent this conversation is when Sky, a trailblazing veteran, asked me if he should be afraid of physical violence from members of his own theater community tonight. Do we want to live like this? I know I don't. Sky is a survivor of the 80s AIDS crisis, received credible death threats when he was running Buddies, and fought and beat the Christian right when it lobbied the Canada Council to stop Buddies from getting its building on Alexander Street. Having said all this, tonight we will not be discussing the Buddies cancellation and the events that led up to it. We will be discussing freedom of speech in the much larger context I have described, knowing that everyone on this panel, coming from a diversity of experiences and viewpoints, identifies as being on the left, and that we all belong to equity-seeking groups, having dedicated our lives to fighting for the rights of and creating space for our marginalized communities. My interest is to reclaim the term freedom of speech from the alt-right and to bring the conversation from the isolated virtual space of social media into the connected space of us all in the room, breathing the same air, looking into each other's eyes, tackling difficult questions together. A connected space is different, and I would argue in opposition to a safe space. A connected space leads to healing. A safe space does not. Thank you, Ryan Cho, for your remarkable talk on the difference between the two. The term safety has been historically and currently used by the powers that be to control those beneath them, such as Black people, people of color, Indigenous people, the LGBTQ2+ community, the poor and working class. For example, working class men in my community are vilified as rapists and gangsters. We are told that poor Latino men are not allowed to seek asylum in the North because their presence will make the North unsafe. The word safety has been weaponized against us for so long, used to keep us out of public space, and now we are weaponizing it against each other. Feelings are welcome tonight as long as they are expressed in the spirit of creating bridges and connecting, as opposed to weapons meant to shut down a view that we are uncomfortable with. If there is normative conflict tonight, we will remember that conflict is not abuse. I would like to quote Helen Keller in the larger context that we find ourselves in, and also to set the stage for the connected space of tonight. Security is mostly a superstition. It does not exist in nature, nor do children as a whole experience it. Avoiding danger and challenge is no safer in the long run than outright exposure. Life is either a daring adventure or nothing. That's Helen Keller, 1880-1968. American author, political activist for women's suffrage, labor rights, socialism, and anti-militarism, the first deaf-blind person to earn a Bachelor's of Arts degree. The values for tonight are radical curiosity and compassion, knowing that we each express our opinions from our own unique lens and in our own particular ways. For me, freedom of speech does not mean that I yell out my views in an echo chamber, but rather the freedom to state my thoughts and ideas in order to hear back from the community so we can find out how to be in solidarity with each other. To quote Zapatista leader Subcomandante Marcos' 1994 response to the question of whether he was gay, yes, I am gay in San Francisco, Black in South Africa, an Asian in Europe, a Chicano in San Isidro, an anarchist in Spain, a Palestinian in Israel, a Mayan Indian in the streets of San Cristobal, a Jew in Germany, a Roma in Poland, a Mohawk in Quebec, a pacifist in Bosnia, a single woman on the metro at 10 p.m., a peasant without land, a gang member in the slums, an unemployed worker, an unhappy student, and of course, a Zapatista in the mountains. I am all the exploited, marginalized, oppressed minorities resisting and saying enough. I am every minority who is now beginning to speak and every majority that must shut up and listen. Another way to frame this is the world-famous Chilean chant, I am Chilean, the people united will never be defeated. So I have asked each of the panelists to speak for 8 minutes. I have given each of them a prompt to share their talk, to shape their talk. After that, 20 minutes will be spent tackling a series of questions that I have prepared. The final 20 minutes will be open to questions from the floor. Samir will go first. So that is Samir Gandesha. He is an associate professor in the Department of the Humanities at SFU, Simon Fraser University. He specializes in modern European thought and culture with a particular emphasis on 19th and 20th centuries. His work has appeared in Political Theory, New German Critique, Constellations Logos, Kant Studian, Philosophy and Social Criticism, Topia, The European Legacy, the European Journal of Social Theory, Art Papers, The Cambridge Companion to Adorno and Herbert Marcuse, A Critical Reader, as well as in several other edited books. He is co-editor with Lars Rensman of Arendt and Adorno, Political and Philosophical Investigations, Stanford 2012. He is co-editor with Johan Hartel of Spell of Capital, Reification and Spectacle, University of Amsterdam Press 2017, and Aesthetic Marx, Bloomsbury Press 2017, also with Johan Hartel. He has also contributed to Open Democracy, Canadian Dimension, the Vancouver Sun, and the Globe and Mail. In the spring of 2017, he was the Liu Boming Visiting Scholar in Philosophy at the University of Nanjing and visiting lecturer at Suzhou University of Science and Technology in China. In February 2019, he will teach a course on the neoliberal personality at the University of Sao Paulo and is a visiting faculty member at the Paris Institute for Critical Thinking. So the prompt that I gave Samir was freedom of speech, safe spaces, and identity politics. And I'm going to give you the microphone now. And Cindy, if you can help by passing out these papers that Samir wants us all to look at. Oh, or that one.
This one is, perfect. Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you so much, Carmen, for the contextualization, as well as for organizing this event. I think it's really decisively important to indicate that free speech must be approached from the left. And so I think this is a wonderful panel that you've put together. I'm really absolutely delighted and honored to have been invited to participate on it. Before I go any further, I'd just like to acknowledge as well that we're on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Indeed, you mentioned that I taught a course at the University of Sao Paulo. I just returned back last night, so I'm a little bit jet lagged. So if at some point I stop making sense, you'll have an indication of why. I essentially want to cover three areas. First, I just want to say a couple of things via a kind of biographical account of where I'm coming from. Secondly, I just want to really emphasize the specific manner in which we can understand free speech from the left and try and reclaim it. And lastly, and most importantly, I want to talk about the question of criticism. And one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is the relationship between aesthetics and politics. And so that's why I want to come to discuss the handout that I've given you. So just by way of biographical background, I just want to make it very clear how seriously I take the question of hate speech and the weaponization of free speech by the right. This is a very serious development over the last couple of years, and it explains why people are very hesitant from the left to address it for fear of being labeled a racist and possibly a fascist. This is something that happened in the discussion that we had at the Institute on the steering committee when I proposed that we have a discussion in the Institute on the question of free speech and academic freedom. There was a tremendous trepidation around this. And so I want to make very clear that this is something that I take seriously. I've been the target of many racialized, racist attacks growing up as a kid on the North Shore. My family comes from East Africa. My extended family was expelled from Uganda in 1972. And that's made me particularly sensitive to and critical of identity politics. It was a certain kind of identity politics which motivated this, but it was also a certain kind of identity politics on the part of the Indian community in East Africa, in particular in Uganda, that in a sense made possible this kind of an authoritarian gesture. And it has to do with the ways in which communities, in a sense, wrap themselves up very tightly and can't cross divides in terms of critical dialogues and engagement and solidarity. So that's essentially where I'm coming from. I want to emphasize that free speech and free expression has always been, since the Renaissance, the Reformation, the French Revolution, most importantly the Haitian Revolution, it's always been part of the repertoire of left politics. So historically, particularly in Western Europe, in North America, free speech has been a part of what we've stood for and what we've struggled for. But somehow this has come to be reversed, and we need to, as Carmen has suggested, reclaim it for ourselves, but also with full knowledge of the consequences of defenses of absolutist forms of free speech. There's also a geographical dimension as well. If we cast our eyes beyond the West, we see that in countries like India, Turkey, Egypt, and many others, it's not the right that's defending free speech and expression, it's a left. So how do we stand in relationship to these movements that are very much on the defensive now, vis-a-vis authoritarian states, movements, and parties, and militias as well? I just came back from Brazil, and I was very much aware of the changes that are afoot in the society. And in the classroom, the students were telling me how now what's happening is that the far right is using some of the tactics that they discerned amongst the left to shut down debate and discourse. This is a major concern for me as director of the Institute, the weaponization of the very things that the left has argued for, safe spaces, for example, to be used against it itself. And I can go into some examples perhaps in the discussion. So that's essentially the first 2 points I wanted to make. The third point, which brings home, I think, the question of the relationship between identity politics and the closing down of free speech and free expression, is the example of Dana Schutz. So you see on page 1, it's a very poor rendition. I apologize for this, but this is the best I could do under very short sort of notice. On the first page, you'll see a painting by the white American painter Dana Schutz. It was done in 2016. It was done for and included in the Whitney Biennale. And this particular painting generated tremendous controversy. It generated tremendous controversy precisely because this was a white artist depicting a particularly raw and painful, brutal moment in American history. In 1955, this young boy, 15 years old, Emmett Till, was murdered, lynched by a group of white thugs who claimed that he had looked, or it's a woman who claimed that he had looked at her sexually. So the family had placed his body in an open casket, and the mother had said specifically, I want the world to see what racism in the United States does to black people. It was very poignant. So Dana Schutz took this on as her subject, and she made this painting. The controversy was that the mixed-race British artist Hannah Black wrote a letter that was co-signed by something like, I think, 46 other artists and critics and curators, very critical of the work, saying that this work must go. That is to say, it must be yanked from the exhibition. But not only that, she argued that this work needed to be destroyed. And one of the premises of this argument, I'm going to go through some of the reasons she gives and then make some conclusions and then finish. One of the reasons she gives for this is that she doesn't want to have black suffering commodified by a white artist. So it must be destroyed. But the artist had never claimed that the work would be for sale and that she would never benefit materially from this instance of black suffering. So the argument, or the case that Hannah Black is making, is that it should be pulled from the exhibition and destroyed. And I think this represents, in its purest form, the logic of identity, or the logic of identity politics. She argues, and these are the reasons she gives, she adduces for the work's destruction, that it's the work is the product of a cold, calculating white gaze. As such, the painting ought not to be acceptable to anyone who cares for or pretends to care about black people. It is not acceptable for a white person to transmute black suffering into profit and fun, though the practice has been normalized for a long time. Schutz's intention to present white shame is undermined by her use of black pain as, quote, a raw material. This subject matter does not belong to Schutz. I really emphasize this. This subject matter does not belong to Schutz, and therefore she has no right to it. Such rights are illegitimate that are founded on the constraints of others. The name Emmett Till is more than a proper name, but is a signifier for, quote, the mournability of people marked as disposable. Non-blacks can neither embody nor understand human suffering. And finally, the painting highlights the appropriation of black culture by white artists and brings into play the history of capitalist appropriation of the lives and bodies of black people with which our present era began. Finally, and the last point really is that Black accuses Whitney of a cynical move of wanting to make, or wanting to itself be topical by focusing on black suffering in an era of particular intensification of violence against black people. Okay, so this is her argument. She argues that insofar as the structures of the West are based on the social death of black people, the work itself must be destroyed because it doesn't take up, and it cannot take up a critical perspective on this. So I think this is very much the logic of identity politics insofar as it asserts a proprietary relationship between a people and its experience. And it creates a kind of cordon around that experience that prevents others from participating in a critical examination of history, of historical trauma, and so on. Now, a different model could be understood to be registered on the opposite page that I've given you. This is Parker Bright, and Parker Bright went to the Whitney Biennale, and he stood in front of this painting, tried to obscure the view of the painting by onlookers. And this, according to the curators, forced a very interesting set of debates and discussions. People asked, well, what are you doing? Well, he has, you can see, he's painted himself retrospectively in front of the work with the slogan, Black Death Spectacle. That's clear what he's doing. He's creating a kind of force field around the work within which we can understand the various kinds of issues that Hannah Black actually raises in her letter. So what I'm doing here is I'm not saying Hannah Black raises illegitimate points, or that her critique is illegitimate. Many of the arguments she's making are extremely important to think about in relationship to this work. But you can't actually do that if the work doesn't exist anymore. Right? And I think it's this gesture of forestalling critique and dialogue. It's an authoritarian gesture, and it's one that can be criticized on any number of levels, not least a political level. If we think about a kind of radical politics as a politics of articulation, of bringing different demands together against some form of, some power block, and this is a kind of hegemonic understanding of what politics is, then we're really in trouble. We're really in trouble because that dialogue, the connected space, is not possible within the premises of this kind of approach. However, Parker Bright does open this up, and I think that's quite interesting. So my last point, I guess, is a question. I'm running out of time. So the last point I'll make here is that we need, in this kind of a space, talking about a theater, talking about theatrical works, talking about artworks more generally, we have to think about the political function of criticism. We have to look at both the success and the failure of a work of art. There'll be both in every work of art there is. And we must understand truth is constituted both by its success and its failure. We can learn perhaps even more from its failure, right, than its truth, right? Ever tried, ever failed? Fail better. And I think this is really what's getting lost, and we're in big trouble as a result. So I'll close there, and we can come back maybe to some of my points in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Samir. Yes, we will. I hope we can come back to a lot of those points. Okay, so next up is Micheal Vonn. Micheal is a lawyer and has been the policy director of the BC Civil Liberties Association since 2004. She has been an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia in the Faculty of Law and in the School of Library, Archival, and Information Studies, where she has taught civil liberties and information ethics. Ms. Vonn is a frequent speaker and media commentator on civil liberties issues and is an advisory board member of Ryerson University's Center for Free Expression. Once upon a time, a long time ago, Ms. Vonn was a theater and performance artist of considerable impropriety. So the prompt that I gave Micheal was, what is hate speech? How does it get legislated? What is not hate speech? What is the difference between hate speech, harmful speech, and offensive speech? Do intention and impact get taken into account when defining hate speech? Can you speak to the BCCLA mandate to defend rights, not ideologies?
In 8 minutes, of course I can. Don't be ridiculous. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about free expression and why the rationale is for free expression. And I'm going to start by saying it's deeply unintuitive. Probably everybody in this room says, yes, I'm for free expression for everybody except that asshole over there, right? That's human. That's the way we all feel. But there's a reason why we defend freedom of expression. And there's a reason why it's one of the fundamental freedoms. So civil liberties, if you're not conversant with the term, we're usually more conversant with the term human rights. Civil liberties is about the defense of fundamental freedoms, which raises the question, fundamental to what? Fundamental to democracy. So the reason why we give such importance to the fundamental freedom of free expression, while there are many human rights, the reason why this is critical is because our democratic theory is one in which the people are sovereign. We are sovereign. We don't have a sovereign who tells us what to think, what to do, and what we're allowed to think and do. We are sovereign. And as the people who are supposed to govern ourselves through our elected representatives, through our discourse, through our participation in understanding policy, nothing, except for a very, very, very thin layer, should be kept from us. So our constitutional rights to freedom of expression involve not only our ability to speak, but our ability to hear. We have a right to hear what others may not wish to hear, because we are sovereign. And this is deeply embedded in the dignity of the individual and the dignity of the citizen. No one should tell us what to think. We should be able to appreciate what we hear and decide for ourselves whether or not we think this is a good idea, a bad idea, a wrong idea, a right idea. That's our job as sovereign citizens. And so deeply embedded in this notion is the idea that our democratic polity depends on our sovereignty, and our sovereignty depends on our ability to speak and hear freely as citizens. So that's why we think this is so terribly important. And one of the things that gets messed up a little bit is you'll hear sometimes people who defend freedom of expression in the abstract by minimizing the harm that hurtful speech can have. That's a mistake. There is harm to hurtful speech. What you'll also hear on the other side of people promoting equality rights is pretending that there's no harm to suppressing speech. And indeed, there's harm there as well. And part of the problem is deciding when the illness is worse than the cure is worse than the illness, right? One of the things that you hear in kind of center-left justifications for why we're concerned about censorship, or having anyone tell us what we're allowed to hear, what we're allowed to say, is that, watch out for that government, because those authorities, your ox could get gored pretty fast, right? The idea that vulnerable groups shouldn't be supporting the suppression of speech because they could be on, very likely will be on, and have historically been on the receiving end of that. So the argument that your ox could get gored, right? That's a very important argument. It has a lot of credence right now with kind of leftist leaning people. However, that is not the civil liberties justification for freedom of expression. The civil liberties justification includes the fact that we might be wrong. I know nobody likes to think that, but it's true. The search for truth is one of the reasons that we want to instill a culture of respect for freedom of expression. We have the right to be wrong, but we also have the right to hear a lot of views because the chances of any one of us being 100% right about anything are effectively jack, right? So the idea that we collectively are going to try to get some semblance of communal consensus around something that we might call the truth without getting too postmodern about it is one of the seminal reasons why we want to, again, defend not only this in law, but as a culture. As a culture. It's part of our intellectual humility that we bring to this process of sharing the social space. So, the law, because I'm the law lady after all, it's why I've been asked here. So, the law. We know we have a constitutional right to freedom of expression. We know that all rights, any right, is not absolute. There's always the potential for the government to justify their violation of your right. But a constitutional justification is a high justification indeed. So while it is not absolute, again, the justifications must be, in this case, expression, very, very high. So when I say the Constitution says this, it means that all other laws, including statutes, legislation, human rights law, must comport with that respect of free expression, conscience, belief, etc. So we know that the criminal hate speech laws do comport. That was something we learned in a case called Keegstra, constitutional challenge against it, and the High Court here, the Supreme Court of Canada, said yes, it is constitutional, but importantly, the bar is very high. I know colloquially we all talk about hate speech. We say hate speech, usually meaning speech we hate. That is not what hate speech is, okay? Hate speech in the criminal context is not merely racist, is not merely full of hate, is not merely a bunch of offensive things. The test is vilification and detestation. And I can say, in terms of what I've heard lobbied against speakers in various venues, that's hate speech, people say confidently. I do not know a venue in Vancouver that has sponsored hate speech in the criminal context. I do not know of a one. Not only not in the ballpark, not in the city where the ballpark is. It is a very high test, and it's important that it be a high test because that's a criminal law, and it has to be constitutional. Detestation and vilification. A lower bar is the Human Rights Code. There the test is not one of willful promotion of hatred with that high bar. Lower bar on the Human Rights Code level, again, not criminal sanctions. There you're looking at exposing persons or classes of persons to hatred or contempt. That's a much lower bar indeed. But let me put this proviso on this. We saw this in the Maclean's magazine case. Remember Mark Stein writing wildly anti-Muslim things in a series of columns that were published by Maclean's magazine, was taken to the Human Rights Tribunal, and that was the standard. Is he exposing individuals to hatred or contempt? Should have been a slam dunk, because everything in his writing suggested this. However, the Human Rights Tribunal, in order to, I suspect, ensure that we're not going to be challenged constitutionally, put into the factors for consideration whether or not the discussion, the context of the discussion, was one of political import. Is it political speech? Because let me tell you, not only do we censor very little, but in terms of the reasons why we protect speech, nothing is higher than political speech in terms of the justification for protection. Again, speaking back to this notion of what we're doing is protecting the sovereignty of citizens. So where the speech is political, it is very difficult, again, in law, to find it a violation of either human rights or the criminal law. So we, again, speak casually about this, and we can chill speech grievously by referring to charges that might be brought or allegations or claims of hate speech. But there is effectively, especially in the criminal context, very little of it. So when we talk about a culture of promoting free expression and the reasons why we want to do that, just know that when people confidently tell you that's hate speech because I know it, they don't, almost assuredly. Again, very casually lobbed around, not generally the case, very rare, very few prosecutions in Canada because the bar is very high. Now, you don't have to agree with that bar. It's part of your freedom of expression. You don't have to like the law. And you can argue for the reform of the law. You can do all kinds of things in relation to the law. But before, again, claims of criminality are made, and I've heard many of them in relation to speakers espousing political views. Before we pollute our discourse with allegations of criminality that are probably not true, let's at least ground our understanding in what the law is, and then proceed to discussing what the cultural reasons, social reasons, artistic reasons for the defenses might be. So those are my minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Wow. Okay, we're just going to keep going, and then we are... Sure, Morgane can go next. I actually had it backwards, but that's okay. Yeah, let's do it. So Morgane is the founder and executive director of the Morgane
Oger Foundation.
Oh, great, thank you. Which was founded to help narrow the gap between Canada's laws and the experience of people on the ground. She is a founding member of the Law Union of BC and serves as vice president of the BC NDP. Supporting the Canadian Human Rights Commission in matters related to transgender rights, Oger is active in the support of transgender persons involved in the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal in detention. Morgane is the chair of the Trans Alliance Society. In recognition for her service to Canada and extending human rights for LGBTQ2+ persons, she was awarded the Meritorious Service Award on behalf of the Queen and all Canadians in 2018. So the prompt for Morgane was, what is harmful? What is offensive? What is the difference between the two? What should equity-seeking communities do when they feel harmed by the content of some artwork? If the content doesn't fall under hate speech, what can be done aside from punishing through mobbing, shunning, and canceling?
Extremism is a pox on all our houses, is I think the lesson I've learned while dutifully trying to convince government to curtail our human rights or our civil rights or our fundamental rights in order to, in order to make space for people. I'm mindful that this conversation is about the arts, and I'm mindful that in the arts, very, 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 very few things go beyond offensive. It takes an awful lot of effort and persistence to go to that next step that that I consider really actually harmful, which is essentially propaganda, harmful propaganda. We do see it, though. We do see people publishing things, usually under the premise of delivering a fact, proposing that something that is actually just propaganda as a fact. And this is offensive. It can also be harmful. And if it's well done and subtle, it actually really is actually oppressive. We've all seen, like the obvious case of this was the Nazi propaganda, right? We could also see it every time there's a war. Our governments put out a vilifying image of the opponent as less than human or less than worthy of humanity. I fight mostly for trans rights. And the trans community is a very, very, very small subset of our population. 0.5%, maybe 1% when it all settles down of the people are transgender. Generally speaking, 1/4 of that population is transsexual. So a very small population. We're outnumbered many, 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 many to one, right? It doesn't take a lot of effort to create the propaganda through art that actually does become harmful. But that doesn't necessarily justify the gold standard of internet pylons that we see, which isn't unique to the left, which is a term that troubles me a lot. Pretending that our political universe is a line in space is an error in my mind. People are multidimensional. I have extremely religious evangelical Christian friends who have fought at my side for trans rights, and I have fairly liberal, very feminist people who continuously harass me, calling me a man on social media. But that internet pylon, by people performing allyship for the people that they perceive have been wronged, that is a pox on all of our houses as well. I've personally been deplatformed now. I was deplatformed from Trinity Western University, so it's a gold star for me. But people more extremist than the groups that were inviting me to speak demanded I be pulled because, of course, I was going to spread contagion that was against the propaganda that was felt to be appropriate. And this is where, of course, art comes in, right? And art can be harmful. And the question is, what do we do about it? And I've been the target of harmful art, actually. Someone painted a picture of someone killing a dragon. I don't remember who that is. Saint so-and-so killing the dragon. And put Bill Watcott's face on the killing of the dragon. Bill Watcott was my opponent in the case that I just ran through, where I'm trying to curtail his fundamental right to free speech and acting out his religious beliefs by claiming that my right to participate in democracy is at least equal. And I guess I was the dragon that he was killing, or let's say the things I stood for. And I can say that I took that personally. It hurt. It was awful. It was also like a lightning rod for the people who felt that I was an abomination to be vilified or demonized. And this is the thing about the strength of art, is we do have the ability with this medium to portray very strong messages and hopefully get people to think about the issues. But the question is, how do we react? How do we react to the awful things that get put forward as art? When someone, for example, paints an entire community as undesirable or worthy of vilification, where do we stop? On the one hand, every time I watch a film that has a transgender character, I grit my teeth waiting for her to be murdered if it's a woman. If it's a man, it's much less likely. On the other hand, it is actually a portrayal of real life in just about every country except Canada, maybe England and France. So it is, after all, reality, as much as I dislike it. The right thing to do is not necessarily to pile on as an ally to trans people, let's say, in my very limited focus of things I care about, and demand the head of the cinematographer or the producer or something like this. But then sometimes it goes further, and the art turns out to be, are you going to give me a 1-minute notice? You are, right?
Yeah, you still have time.
Okay, good. And then sometimes the production is like really questionable, and you wonder, what the hell? But then, as far on the left as I am, sometimes I do believe in the free market, a la, Keynesian free market. I do believe that as much as let's say someone has a right to put art together, the marketplace has a right to ridicule it, to tear it to pieces, to not give a rat's ass about the feeling of the person who put it together when they put something so incredibly awful that it needed to be shamed out of the space. We should still suffer through it, but still, nonetheless, god-awful art is still god-awful, and that's all there is to it. And I think we do need the articles that point this out and that talk about how awful and how unacceptable the art is. But we shouldn't actually pull it unless it depicts something really, really propaganda-esque. Because only propaganda, and of course, that's what the other people do that I don't like, right? So other people's propaganda is not okay. Mine's good. Right.
So now you do have 1 minute.
Okay, thank you. It would take a lot for me to support vilifying the artist beyond calling them an idiot when they do something stupid. And when an artist steps in bear poop, which a number of them do, I recommend that we all step back a little bit and remember that there are bigger problems out there. As we speak, the extreme right in our country is organizing. I see them organizing to take away my human rights through legislation, pulling back, laws that have been passed. That's much worse. In the hierarchy of needs, that's on the top of my needs. Keep the laws as they are. I have a few things here. So, the internet pylon on the victim who stepped in bear poop. 1, do not expect more perfection from someone else than from yourself. 2, acts of kindness go a long ways. Maybe give them a kind opportunity to, reflect. Instead of attacking them, you're not trying to get points. That little thing, the 10,000 likes thing on your Twitter thing, isn't necessarily a sign that you've done something good. Empathy goes a long ways. Maybe one day this is going to happen to you. And therefore, maybe you should be nice to this poor fool who stepped in an obvious bear poo. And finally, we need to talk more about vicarious trauma. This idea that no, you don't personally understand something that doesn't happen to you or people like you on the basis of who you are, which is the only reason to really be offended or the main reason to be offended by what people might do. I do not understand racialization as a person receiving it. It's not something I receive. I really should not be the one tearing someone apart on a racial issue because I don't know what I'm talking about. I need to let the people who are affected by issues speak for themselves and not drag them as a good ally, forcing them to a conversation that they don't necessarily want to be having through me. And I think we all owe that to people. We all owe to each other to not force an issue on the table because maybe that's not the issue that the community being affected wants to speak about right now on your timing. And this is something that I've come across a number of times. People doing internet pylons, the big shame game on people who didn't mean to do something bad, and the people really pushing this pylon are unaffected by the outcome. They're unaffected by all the negativity that comes out of it. And they're not the ones coming up with any solutions or any ideas, and they're not the ones actually hurting. They're just setting fire to the barn to watch it burn. And I think we need to be very careful about that. We need to be careful about not following the people who like to watch the world burn. We need to get together with the people who are our natural enemies, if there's such a thing. And I worked very, very hard to get some laws passed in BC and in Canada, and almost none of our work involved watching the world burn. What it involved was reaching out to the people who we assume hate us and building bridges. And the worst, most god-awful artist out there obviously needs bridge building and empathy lessons. And I think this is where we are today. if I have any advice to the universe, less radicals, less extremists, and more empathy. But still, keep them accountable for the shitty art. I don't need to see it. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, Sky is next. Sky Gilbert is a poet, novelist, actor, playwright, filmmaker, theater director, and drag queen extraordinaire. He has been a groundbreaking activist and a controversial personality in the Canadian theater community and the Canadian queer community for nearly 40 years. He has had more than 40 plays produced and written 7 critically acclaimed novels, including Guilty, also translated into French, Brother Dumb, Wit in Love, and Come Back, and 3 award-winning poetry collections, Digressions of a Naked Party Girl, Confessions of a Juvenile Delinquent, and A Nice Place to Visit, as well as a memoir, Ejaculations from the Charm Factory. His plays, including the iconic Drag Queens on Trial, have found a place in the Canadian theatrical canon. He has received 3 Dora Maver Moore Awards for his theater work, as well as the Pauline McGibbon Award and the Silver Ticket Award. He also received the Relit Award for his novel An English Gentleman in 2004. There is a street in Toronto named after him, Sky Gilbert Lane. His latest novel, Sad Old Faggot, ECW Press, was critically acclaimed. He is presently working on a cantata, Shakespeare's Criminal, with composer Dustin Peters, starring famed mezzo Marion Newman, to be presented at Factory Studio Theatre in April. In 2019, Playwrights Canada Press will publish Sky's critically acclaimed play, It's All True, about the criminalization of AIDS. In 2020, Guernica Press will publish Sky's new book about Shakespeare's style, Shakespeare, Beyond Science. Dr. Sky Gilbert is a professor at the School of English and Theatre Studies in Guelph, where he specializes in creative writing, sexuality, and Shakespeare. So the prompt that I gave Sky was his views on hate speech laws and what he has referred to as the Puritanism that, in his view, has taken over the theatre world.
Thank you, Carmen. Thank you for everything. The West, and by that I mean Anglo-Saxon England as well as Europe, has not had an easy time with the imagination. Ever since the Enlightenment, there's been a general skepticism about poetry and art, as both were originally allied with God and magic. With Enlightenment came science and the scientific method, which were associated with Puritanism. So at the very beginning of the Enlightenment, that is in the late 1500s, skepticism about art and poetry was associated with people who were not very sexual. It all started with Ramus. Ramus was not so much the first scientist as a pre-Enlightenment rhetorician who managed to reduce the importance of rhetoric in education, which means that students no longer learned about the world through art. They learned about it through science, through experiment. Yes, before Ramus, it was generally thought that if you wanted to know what a flower was, you should read a poem about a flower. That the last thing you would do is actually look at a flower. Ramus was a Protestant and not too fond of the kind of imagery associated with rhetoric. Before books, the way people remembered the words of poems and speeches was through memory. Memory was the most important features, one of the most important features of rhetoric, and memory was really the source of all imagination. In order to remember words, the art of memory suggested that people should store that information in their mind's eye, one of Shakespeare's favorite phrases. The mind's eye was a term for the process of setting up in your brain, houses on streets, and these houses would contain rooms, and in each room would be an image used which would bring up the words of your poetry or speech. It was suggested that the image used should be ones that you would not forget. Sorry. And it was often suggested that they be violent or sexual ones. In fact, teachers of memory suggested images of naked women and monsters placed in those rooms in the brain. Ramus decided that the mind's eye was not the best way to remember things. Instead, if someone wanted to make a speech, write a poem, they should instead think in their mind of the page of a book and put things in the page of the book and imagine different headings. Of course, this is more the way you remember things today, but when Ramus destroyed the art of memory, he did something to the imagination. It is my theory that Shakespeare's plays are about this destruction of the imagination that Ramus tried to effect, and Shakespeare was not happy with it. Ramus's theories were partly about science and partly about Puritanism. Ramus wanted to teach people the scientific method, which meant books and linear thinking, experimentation, but he also didn't want them thinking about monster snakes and naked women. God help us. Art was policed by these Puritans and scientists from the early 1700s until quite recently, when art and poetry have been celebrated, when they're decadent, extreme, confounding, and obscene. But now, the tide has turned and it's time to attack the arts again, and I contend this modern suppression is related to the old one. The three ways in which the puritanical so-called science is seeking to silence our imagination are A, through theories of appropriation, B, through hate speech, and C, through the Me2 movement. The notion of appropriation claims to be related to the facts. Appropriation is based on essentialism, the idea that the classifications that we use to separate people have an essential relationship to their nature as defined by science, but there's no gay experience. Just the way there is no black experience or trans experience, there are many different experiences that vary according to class, religion, upbringing, country, etc. So you might say appropriation, it's not about appropriating a black experience. Generally, it concerns writing about any experience you have never had. To tell a writer that they are only allowed to write about what they have experienced would mean that there would be no murder mysteries, as hardly anybody is a murderer, thank God. But we do share, most of us, the urge to hurt someone, usually out of revenge or hurt that's been done to us, and that's why we can write and enjoy murder stories without actually experiencing murder. But some people who create characters that are outside their experience will probably write very badly, there's ineptly about those people. Well, let the critics, just saying, splice and dice them. I asked Thompson Highway what he thought about appropriation, and he said, anybody can write anything they want, but they might not get it right. And if they don't get it right, they will be held accountable. Appropriation is puritanical because it betrays a deadening fear of the subconscious and of fantasy. We might make up dangerous things, untrue things. Shakespeare did not agree with this theory. One of the characters in As You Like It says, the truest poetry is the most feigning, which means the truest poetry is the most lying poetry. I believe, examining this closely, that Shakespeare believed this. Hate speech is another puritanical restriction that is based on false science. I don't believe that any speech should be deemed a crime under the law. If someone kills someone or rapes someone, they should be held accountable for that crime. But it is impossible to hold them accountable for what is in their hearts because we'll never know. The concept of hate speech is based on the puritanical Christian idea that Christ expressed in the Sermon on the Mount, an idea which even Christians today have trouble with, the notion that to think something is as bad as to do it. Thoughts are not evil or good, they are merely pleasant or unpleasant. Speech can be frightening and deeply wounding, but it is different than physical violence. Adult speech should be free and mostly unregulated. What is one man's hate speech is another man's flowery language. I called myself a fag on the radio once, and a very uptight lesbian I know cited me on her horrid little website that catalogs hate speech. What next? And finally, policing hate speech only leads to the propagation of hate. I guarantee that you won't see the word in a newspaper in the Deep South in the USA, but that doesn't mean that racism is over. In fact, it might be worse because people congratulate themselves on the fact that they no longer use those bad words and pretend racism over, but in fact they use these words in private and guard their outlawed racist cultures passionately. Finally, if you can't allow hate speech, how can you talk about hate? And we sure need to talk about it. Finally, there's the Me2 movement, which is clearly a puritanical movement related to false science. On the one hand, Me Too is a positive thing because women need to call out rapists, and rapists need to be jailed for their crimes. But along with Me Too comes the pseudoscientific idea of false essentialism. Not all men are rapists or violent, not all women are nice or loving, and not all women are the passive partners in sexual intercourse. Many women, they are called dominatrixes, do not wait for men to ask for sex and consider it insulting. They would have to consent to sex, and see even the notion of consent is sexist. They are the women who ask, or more accurately, demand sexual things from men. It is the man who is penetrated. Okay. The real problem, as Catherine Deneuve and the French feminists have discovered, is that along with Me Too has come censorship. It has gotten to the point where certain artists, Woody Allen, Roman Polanski, and Louis C.K. are examples, are having their work rejected. You try and find a copy of Louis C.K.'s movie, I Love You, Daddy, anywhere. It has been censored. Because of the it has been censored because of the crimes of the creator, because of #MeToo. The other problem with #MeToo is that it has created a climate in which artists, poets, and filmmakers are reluctant to deal with sexual subject matter. Because if they do so, it might be too controversial. Catherine Deneuve speaks of filmmakers who are avoiding sexual topics. They are just too afraid it will offend someone. I want to say, and I'm finishing, quite unsimply and with complete lack of any control whatsoever, that poetry must be free. As Shakespeare says, words are wanton, they are promiscuous, and they attach themselves to other words. And as Derrida says, they derive their meaning from their association with other words, from their coitus with other words, and all words contain within them the opposite meaning, and I am a flowering, fucked up motherfucking fag who loves to fuck, and I play in the hills and valleys of my lovers' bodies and their bums and chests and pecs, and all the places where they can be private and sacred and free and smelly and confess their sins to me as if I am their God, which they do nightly when I hold my lovers in my arms. Yes, you see what words do? They're dangerous, scary, and dirty, and scandalous, and blasphemous. And that's why poetry must be free.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I wonder if Omari is still with us.
Oh, I'm here.
Okay, all right, Omari. Okay, well, that's Omari on the screen over there joining us from Montreal.
Hello.
Hello. Omari Newton is an award-winning professional actor, writer, director, and producer. As a writer, his original hip-hop theater piece, Sal Capone, has received critical acclaim and multiple productions, including a recent presentation at Canada's National Arts Centre. He has been commissioned by Black Theatre Workshop in Montreal to write a companion piece to Sal Capone entitled Black and Blue Matters. The new piece is set to premiere at Black Theatre Workshop in 2019. Omari and his wife, fellow professional playwright Amy Lee Lavoie, recently received a generous grant from the Canada Council to co-write a new play, Redbone Coonhound. Their latest collaboration is a bold and innovative satirical comedy that confronts instances of systemic racism in the past, present, and future. Newton's work in Speakeasy Theatre's production of young Jean Lee's The Shipment earned him a 2017-2018 Jesse Richardson Award for Outstanding Performance by an Actor, as well as a nomination for Best Direction. Notable film and TV credits include Lucas Ingram on Showcase's Continuum, Larry Summers on Blue Mountain State, and lending his voice to the Black Panther in multiple animated projects by Marvel. Most recently, Omari has a recurring role as Nate on Corner Gas, the animated series.
Yeah, I do.
Oh, yes, you do. And a recurring role as Corvus of Netflix's hit new animated series, The Dragon Prince. So Omari's prompt that I gave him was the tension between freedom of speech and cultural appropriation.
Yeah, and it was in the context of Robert Lepage's two plays, Slave and Canada. So I'm hearing myself in the echo, so maybe I'll try to take these off and be able to speak more freely. So the interesting thing about understanding this controversy and understanding Robert Lepage is just understanding Quebec and the cultural scene in Quebec, where I'm from. I was born and raised in Montreal. For those who don't know, Quebec and Montreal, they are inherently racist. It's an inherently racist place. And I say this in the sense that, to me, there's two types of racism. There's overt racism, which, to be blunt, most white people understand. Overt racism is when, somebody says the N-word and, offends you. And there's more systemic or, embedded racism that it affects you in more insidious ways. And Quebec is a deeply systemically racist place, in particular the cultural scene. And to give you some context for this, Quebec is a place where, as recently as 2 years ago, a major theater company called Théâtre Rideau Vert, they have a year-end review show. And in this show, they depict different local celebrities. And every year when Black celebrities are depicted, they don't hire Black actors to portray these celebrities. They have white actors who darken their face. And I don't want to be alarmist and say that it's blackface, because it's not blackface in the traditional sense where you see the jet black skin and the red lips. But it does come from this legacy of erasure and dehumanization of blackface. And this is not an isolated incident where most of the society condemned this practice and said, I can't believe they're doing this. The general consensus amongst mainstream people in Quebec was, well, what's the big deal? We don't have a history of racism in Quebec, so why is this a problem? The premier of Quebec, Francois Legault, a few weeks ago, there was a motion to have a day to recognize, activism against Islamophobia in Quebec. And this was dismissed in the province of Quebec. And the premier, Francois Legault, said, well, we don't have Islamophobia in Quebec, so this day is unnecessary. And this came 2 days after the anniversary of a mass shooting at a mosque in Quebec. So I feel like it's important for people to understand where these protests originated from and the seeds of these protests. Now, there was a lot of activists on the ground in Montreal who reached out to Lepage through more legal channels to try to get his attention and try to have him, hear them and invite them into the room when these plays were being made. And they felt as though largely their concerns just fell on deaf ears, and he didn't care and he didn't work with them. So when you talk about call out culture and shutting people down, I just think it's disingenuous to talk about that without acknowledging the fact that these are last resorts that people often go to because no one is listening to them. And I forgot the name of a lawyer on the panel who laid out the threshold for hate speech in Canada and very accurately pointed out that by the legal definition, it's very difficult to pin something as hate speech. But I can't sit here as a black man and not put this on the table. When, as a black man or a marginalized person, have we been able to fully depend on legal thresholds for justice? I'm very concerned with hearing people say, talk about radicalism or extremism in any circumstance is a scourge of the earth and it's a problem. When every single right and freedom I have as a black man was snatched violently from the hands of a white supremacist oppressive state. Martin Luther King was a radical and extremist on an FBI watch list. Rosa Parks was a radical and an extremist. Harriet Tubman was a radical and extremist. Like, the laws made things like slavery legal, segregation legal, and it was through radical action that we had change. Now, I'm not trying to imply that in 2019 we're dealing with similarly overt and oppressive circumstances, but I just think, yes, there is a concern with censoring voices. But I don't think someone like Robert Lepage has been censored. And especially if you remember the fact that the term censorship generally speaks about state apparatus stepping in and intervening with someone getting their voice out, whether that's through funding or whether that's through shutting them down. And I think not only has Lepage not censored, quite the opposite. He's been supported healthily throughout the years by the state. And when protesters were outside in the theater trying to protest him, the physical arm of the state, being the police, were on his side. They were allowing people to go into the theater. So Lepage was not censored. And then if you want to look at the case of whether what he was doing was cultural appropriation, if you accept the definition of cultural appropriation as, interpreting work from a culture that is not yours without the collaboration or integrating the ideas of the people from the culture you're using, I think it is a pretty clear case of cultural appropriation. Now, all of this being said, do I think his show should be canceled? Do I think we should send cops in and shut it down? Of course not. I think that's absurd. But I think we do have a legal right to organize and protest and raise concerns for things that we find offensive. And as a matter of fact, the only time we've gotten anything was from organizing and raising our voices. So I don't see this as a problem. And I just think if you acknowledge that we live in a patriarchy and in a white supremacist system, we have to use what we have at our disposal to hold people who are being propped up by the mainstream. A guy like Robert Lepage, a white man in Quebec, who's received so much support and so much funding for many, many years, and with good reason. I'm not taking anything away from him artistically or creatively. The man is an artistic genius. But he's been supported quite a bit, and he's shown a great inability or a lack of empathy or humility to just hear the voices of people of color asking just to be brought into the room and let into the table. And had he been more amenable to just having a conversation, we wouldn't have got to the point where people trying to shut him down or being outside of the theater protesting him. And I guess I'll end with the difference to me between honoring a culture and appropriating a culture. To me, you look at a case of someone like, the hip hop artist Eminem, who is problematic for a number of reasons, but has been largely embraced by Black communities all across North America, in a predominantly Black medium that has its roots in African American culture, because he never tried to appropriate the culture and pretend to be something he wasn't and speak in a cadence or in a voice that was foreign to him. He came out saying, "I'm a white man from Detroit." He talked about class, about how he was poor, and people could relate to his story. Versus if you go back further, a guy like Vanilla Ice, who came from quite a bit of affluence and from Palm Springs, and he acted as though he was a black man, or acted as though he was an oppressed, marginalized person, and people rejected the falseness of what he was doing. So I just think you have the right to freely express yourself as much as you want, and not only do marginalized people have the rights to raise concern about it, history will tell us the only channels we have to have our voices heard are by organizing together and making a lot of noise about what's happening to us. And I guess I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Wow, thank you. Thank all of you so much. Okay, so I noticed, Samir, for example, you were taking some notes. So we can do one of two things, but I would love to hear, because I saw you taking some notes. We can go to some of the questions that I had prepared, or if any of you, and I mentioned Samir just because I saw you taking notes, but maybe it's somebody else too, wants to respond to anything that one of the other presenters said, we can do that first. That would be great. I saw you taking notes, and I would love to hear what your response might be to the other speakers.
Yes, well, thank you for this most recent contribution, Omari. I've found that your contextualization of these plays by Lepage to be very important and very useful. And then the discussion of these two rappers to in a sense contradictory poles or opposite poles. Vanilla Ice on the one side and then Eminem on the other as ways of understanding, so honoring a culture as opposed to culturally appropriating it, or appropriating that culture. I think this is really important, but I wonder if it captures, in a sense, one side of the question, and what gets lost in the larger discussion and debate is the way in which, in our late capitalist societies, culture has become thoroughly commodified, right? And we speak in terms of, say, the culture industry, and we somehow think that that question is, in a sense, subordinate to the individual stances of these artists and the way they are received or not received by particular cultures. And I think that an example of this kind of blindness is the calling out by members of Black Lives Matter of Nikki Ashton during her bid to be leader of the NDP. And she accused Nikki Ashton of culturally appropriating Beyonce. And I thought this was just wrong-headed, to be frank. This is, a multi-million-dollar artist, and Beyonce, Nikki Ashton, wished to use her song "To the Left" to indicate a kind of approach within this country, within the NDP, that was aligning itself with figures like Bernie Sanders in the States, Jeremy Corbyn, Podemos, and so on. A discussion that really needs to happen, and a movement that really badly needs to happen, especially now with the Liberal Party's position in such a kind of crisis, without there being a proper left option in this country from the NDP. So I think these are the larger discussions that I'd also like to have. Yeah, critique the ways in which particular artists don't honor cultures, yes, but also there's a larger problem of commodification, the untrammeled rule of finance and money in our societies, which frankly make things especially difficult for communities of color, for the working class communities, for LGBTQ plus communities. and so on. So I'd like to broaden that discussion up.
If I can interject for a second.
Yes,
The commodification of art, and particularly the art of Black people, is nothing new. In the context of Slave, where they're singing Negro spirituals were born after the transatlantic slave trade, when Black people were being indoctrinated with Christianity, and they remixed those Christian songs to fight for their liberation. So for a white man in 2019 to straight up commodify those songs while erasing the voices and bodies of Black people on stage is an affront that I think needs to be called out with him specifically as an individual. So I don't think that's a trivial point to call Lepage out specifically.
I'm not saying it's not. I agree with you on that point. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, but since we're on that, Samir, can you please speak to the tension between identity politics and class analysis? So, for example, why is being homeless not an identity? Or being poor not an identity? Why is being working class not an identity? So if you could speak to the lack of class analysis when it comes to identity politics, that would be great.
Okay, I'll try and be brief and then let others come in.
Go ahead, yeah.
But thank you for this question. I think it's a really crucial question, because when we think of identities rooted in certain experiences of particular racialized communities, the LGBTQ plus community of women, I think we're talking about something of a slightly different order than when we're talking about the condition of the working class, understood in a radical critique of society, and also you can say the homeless. The former demand a certain kind of recognition within the existing social order. Recognition and inclusion in particular ways. One does not want to be denied a job because of one's identity. One does not want to be denied an opportunity at a higher educational institution because of one's identity. So one demands equal respect. So there's a claim for affirmation. Now, I think that a radical critique of class isn't simply that the working class must be included in particular ways, or that there should be greater redistribution. Those things should happen, yes. But I think the more radical approach to class is its negation. So the working class, the proletariat, stands as a principle of negation or negativity in a capitalist society that can only include this class by abolishing it and by abolishing itself. Now, there will be many people in this room who won't agree with that approach to class analysis. It's more like, well, you add class onto race and ethnicity and linguistic group, confessional group, and so on. It's one of the many forms of intersectionality. This is a different approach, which says, no, class, the working class identity is actually the crisis of the very order in which the working class is produced, and its role within this order, right? And I think that it occupies a very different sort of position, and that also should figure in this discussion more. I mean, we're seeing societies ever more divided by massive social inequality. I don't have to tell people this. It's just a basic fact. And I think unless we get to the heart of this question, we won't be able to fully understand the rebarbative forms of racism that are emerging again. Forms of ethnocentrism, ethno-nationalism, hostility towards migrants and refugees. That's where we really need to direct our attention. And the way we do it is by incorporating a dimension of negativity and radicality into our critique.
So, Morgane, I saw you taking some notes. Do you want to say something?
The working class helped elect a new government in BC by responding to the message that my party gave, which I don't speak for here, which was that, we have to make life better for regular working people. That was basically the refrain. I think within organizations, the working class is very active and very certain of who it is, what that means, and within the context of the working class, there is the context of equity-seeking groups and people who've had enough of being marginalized, and who or have had enough of protesting actions. Omari, when I was speaking about radicals, I meant significantly more radical than, protesting for your entire life for more justice. I meant the people who are just kind of going in all directions. I think we need to allow everybody to be represented, right? And we are fighting for everybody. All of us are fighting for everybody to be included, no matter who they are. And this is how this is how the quote left has been operating for quite a while, through different lenses based on who the people are who are speaking, I would say, rather than through one analysis or another that is lacking or not lacking. We have people speaking for themselves or for an idea that they put forward, and we have to certainly keep on doing that.
Yes, I was going to say.
I was just going to reiterate maybe something about what counter speech is. More speech, right? What is the answer to speech you don't like? More speech. So I don't, if there was any indication that counter speech, a counter demonstration, standing up and saying, Mr. Lepage, you suck, or whatever you would like to say, that is well within the parameters of free speech. It's your exercising yours. The difference about a culture of disrespecting free speech is not saying your mind, organizing, or doing anything in relation to that. It is trying to get that speaker, that artist deplatformed. It's demanding the retraction of it. It's trying to aim at the defunding or anything else that removes their right to speak.
But if I'm
They're wrong, right? But like again, the advocacy that you do and the speaking that you do is entirely within the bounds. So I don't want anyone to think that demonstrating or counter-demonstrating constitutes a suppression of the speech that it is that you are opposing, right? That's the response that a democracy demands. So I just wanted to clarify that to make sure that that's all in. That's all in. The difference between that and what we're seeing, even in academic journals, the culture of this is so insidious at this moment that the thing we call science, where through an iterative process of discovering this evidence versus this evidence, a synthesis of what we say, the evidence now demonstrates to a reasonable consensus. No. When somebody doesn't like the evidence, right now in the academy, in academe, the idea is, let's get that pulled. Let's take it off the record. We don't like that research. In fact, maybe we don't even like the fact that this research happened because we didn't like the result. Okay, scientists are doing this. Scientists are deplatforming other scientists. We have lost the notion, again, of the idea that everybody is contributing. Their speech, their work, their science. The idea, again, is not that repudiating that, denying it, saying that you dispute it, that's all within the appropriate catchment. The difference is trying to erase from history, get it retracted, or visit some punishment on them, be it through doxing them or anything else, for their speech. That's the line. That's the line.
Could I
Go.
respond?
Yes. So Omari, you respond. Then I have.
Call me Michael, for God's sake. Hello.
So Omari, you respond. Then I'm going to ask a question, and then we're going to open it to the floor, and then we're going to end the evening. So yes, Omari, go ahead.
Well, look, I'm not advocating for destroying works of art that I object to, but I think it is completely legitimate in a publicly funded art model such as we have in Canada, particularly in theater, when you've been systemically shut out of things like, funding bodies or juries or access to auditions or opportunities. When you've suffered those indignities for a very long time, and then you see works of art that then erase your culture, it makes sense to go, yeah, my tax dollars should not support that. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to call for. And whether that meets the legal threshold for that to happen, that's a different conversation. But philosophically speaking, you should ask your government in a democracy to exercise the will of the people. And if you're being shut out of having your voice heard and being counted as the people, you're left with nothing else but literally screaming outside of a building when a bunch of people are making money for things about your culture that you've been shut out of. I don't see that as unreasonable.
Yes, and I think that Michael was saying that she doesn't see that as unreasonable either. That's what I heard her say.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
respectfully, I was listening pretty closely, and she explicitly said that calling to defund art.
Oh.
You explicitly said that, and that's what I'm responding to.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, okay.
So what I'm talking about is the kind of thing that we see, particularly again in the academy. I've seen less of it in the arts, but I'm worried about the trend, where you say not only is this piece of, I mean, I can think of again a lot of academic examples. Not only is this piece should be retracted, but this person shouldn't be in the academy. Their job should be questioned. Their PhD should be queried. All of those kinds of things. That level of personal attack at the place where we're talking about supporting a culture of expression and contribution is deeply problematic. To say, hey, Canada Council, I don't think you should be funding this kind of art. I think you should be funding this. That's ordinary political speech. Go, go, go. But again, the attacks on the individual that strike at livelihood, strike at personal safety, those are the kinds of things that we're seeing increasingly. And again, while sometimes the line may be blurry, it just has to be put on the table. This is not supporting a culture of contribution, and it is not ordinary counter-speech. So again, the idea of saying, this is the art that shouldn't be funded, you should be funding this, completely support it. That is political speech, and you have an absolute right to it. And many people may wish to do that. Yeah.
In the case of Lepage, neither his livelihood or safety were being threatened, though.
Okay, we're just going to move on from the
Okay.
Lepage thing just for a second. But no, this is all great for us to hear, all of these sides to it. Then I'm going to ask a question, then we're going to go to the floor. This is for you, Sky, but you don't have to answer it, okay? Maybe somebody else will answer it. So currently, there seems to be no redemption narrative. When an artist, or a scholar or a student, but let's say an artist, creates a work of art or says something that is experienced as hateful to an equity-seeking group, an apology is not enough, relinquishing space is not enough. I'm just going to read a couple of lines that you wrote on your blog, if that's okay, since they're public. After the cancellation of your play reading, and there was the long table, you wrote on your blog, amongst other things, listening to people at the long table, this is you talking, it became clear to me that Buddies is no longer a gay and lesbian theater, as it was when I was the artistic director. It has evolved into a space for a new generation of people challenging the mainstream in a new way. In order for those who have been wounded by the white colonial capitalist patriarchy to heal, they need their own home, and they must take power in that home. Buddies is now a home for people representing a range of intersectional genders and identities. This is a wonderful thing, and I applaud it. Even those words seem to not be enough, right, for people who hate the poem that you wrote. So what is the redemption narrative?
There is no redemption. And thankfully, I am terribly old and will probably be dead in not too far distant. I don't really have a future. The future is my creative and personal future that I will make. And it's not about being out there in the public square, probably, but that's fine because I had my day in the public square. So that's all I'd say. But oh no, there's no redemption. Like, I mean, to the people who are have demonized me, and it's almost a religious form. It is religious, actually, and I have a lot of problems with organized religion. I have no problem with people's spiritual relationship, as long as you keep quiet about it, and it's your relationship with whatever you relate to up there and out there. That's fine. But when it becomes organized religion, yeah, and this is organized religion. There's no doubt about it. If you saw the long table that was organized around me, it was, wow. It was all about, those people were definitely speaking to a religious fervor. They were confessing, they were crying, they were, and I realized that there was a lot of emotion that they had to go through, but it was a kind of a public, for me, a very frightening display of public. It was like you're going inside a revivalist church, which is fine. And I realized some people need that. But as I said, I'm not an organized religion sort of guy, and it doesn't have anything to do, in my view, with politics or ideas or thinking. It has to do with some sort of, because you use the word redemption, and it's absolutely accurate. No, there is no redemption for someone like me. I've spoken my mind, and the people who it has filled them with the hate that they imagine I have. But I will say that many people who've read my piece have said, they didn't quite get what was hateful about my speech, and because it was kind of wimpy, my little poem. It was all about can't we love each other and stuff like that. But anyway, that's a whole complex thing. But no, the basic answer is no redemption for me.
Yes, and that's what I find terrifying about the current conjuncture that we find ourselves in on the left, that there is no redemption. So yes, why don't you speak, Morgane? And then we have, we're not too late. Then we have a time for a couple of questions from the floor.
You don't get redemption by repeating yourself over and over again. People who seek redemption do it by saying, man, I am so sorry. I really overstepped. And it's like, I've lashed out at people saying stupid things that I never should have said. All right. I have a few tweets out there. I called Christianity a death cult in a tweet. I meant it, and I still mean it, but it hurt people's feelings when I did that. Right. And I gotta say, sometimes there, redemption is not achieved without some pretty clear parameters. It's like truth and reconciliation, right? I was at a big truth and reconciliation thing, and it was all pretty and lots of great speeches and things like this. And this elder next to me, leans over, we were talking, and they say, first you have to start by stopping the oppression before you can reconcile. And I'm very new to this story, and I don't want to rehash it too much. But what I saw is what? That book, that title, I feel that way. I'm afraid of men too. And they're afraid of me as well. That's why they've tried to kill me more than once. That's why I have restraining orders on people. Or at least threats of restraining orders from the police. And then when I go and I write something that really hurts people's feelings, let's say the fundamentalists, who I only have a tolerance for, when they're being really harshly anti-LGBT specifically, and then they tell me that was really hurtful, I know that I'm in a fork in the road, right? I can choose to say, yeah, you know what, I went too far. Or I can choose to stick him in the eye, right? And that's the difference between choosing redemption and choosing to stick him in the eye, right? And there is plenty of room for redemption. And lots of people have overstepped and gone too far and said they're sorry without the big humiliation ritual that's necessary sometimes, right? But nonetheless, continuing down the path isn't the way. And sometimes it's like, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. That goes a long ways towards redemption.
Okay, thank you very much. And just to add something to what you just said, Morgane, the thing is that in the theater community, we all have to work with each other. That's the thing, right? We all have to work with each other. We are on juries, and we decide who gets funding because it's all peer juries. So this is where this redemption question is also coming from, right? If one of us makes a piece of art that really offends an equity-seeking group, it seems right now that we're in a place, and I've had this conversation privately with many people. People are afraid to have it publicly, right? We are in a place where no matter what the artist does, to say I'm sorry, or here's the space, or there doesn't seem to be movement. But what I want to do now, just because these people have been sitting here very patiently for a very long time, is are there any questions from the floor? And if you do want to have a question, there is a microphone over there. Please know that you are being filmed. If you don't want to be filmed, just raise your hand, and we will give you the microphone, and we will hear your voice, but we won't see your image on the video. There's a person in the audience who said we're also afraid. Oh, there you go. Thank you.
First of all, thanks for speaking on this issue. It's something that's rarely spoken about on the left, and in fact, we hear, the complete opposite of everything that you've said tonight. So thank you. I'm just wondering, where does this position of censorship and deplatforming and mob mentality come from? Is it an insecurity of their position? Is it so ideological that they want to overcome oppression that they're willing to go to authoritarian measures to achieve it? I'm just wondering, how does one come to a place where they want to stand up for people so much that they're willing to oppress people and go to authoritarian measures? I don't know how to quite frame that, but hopefully you understand what I'm getting at there. I'll put that out to anybody.
Okay. Okay. Michael, I saw you reaching for. Okay. Or was it Samir? Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to just briefly respond to that, because I think one would require a lot more time to go into enough depth to adequately respond to the question. But there have been a number of different accounts of identity politics, and I think one of the most powerful is offered by people like Adolph Reed Jr., a longtime radical black activist, situates himself within the black radical tradition, and Walter Ben Michaels as well. And they see identity politics as embodying a certain kind of logic of neoliberalism. So it's a way in which what they call the managerial class to both maintain and bolster their own position vis-a-vis oppressed communities. So the gatekeeping is about maintaining their power within their own communities, being spokespeople for their communities, but not really questioning questions of class. So that's one way of understanding this. A way that I also try and understand this is in terms of the way in which our societies are increasingly ruled by abstraction. Right, the role of banking and finance in our world and debt is becoming ever more pronounced. It seems as if we live in these societies in which it's very difficult to get clear and present a kind of narrative about where we've come from and where we're going in terms of the main power structures, the social and economic political structures that rule our lives. So in order to combat abstraction, we want to go for something concrete and something substantive, something that we can really hold on to and grasp and gives our life a kind of meaning. And I think there's a sort of identity politics of the left which tries to do this in various ways through critiques of cultural appropriation and so on. Again, this understanding of experience as a kind of property that one can possess. Right? Experience doesn't work like that. It's not an object or a thing that can be possessed by any particular group. And then, of course, we see the right identitarianism. And this is a very troubling development. As we know, since the election of Trump, there's been a licensing for the very, very clear expression of white supremacy. And I think it serves similar kinds of needs. In no way do I equate the two. I think they're very different, but they respond to a very similar kind of logic of abstraction, the fear, anxiety, and insecurity that abstraction produces in our lives. So we want something concrete, but I call this a false concretion. We need to look at the social structures clearly and have an analysis, have intellectual and political debates and discussions about this, as opposed to expressing our feelings. There's a room for that. There's a time and place for everything. But I think we've gone too far in that direction, and we need to think very carefully about the worlds in which we live.
Can I add? So the metrics that we have that demonstrate that we're in a time of almost unprecedented polarization are startling. I don't know if anybody saw the Maclean's magazine dual issue. On one side it said, what's wrong with the left, and the other side it said, what's wrong with the right. And they demonstrated some really astonishing things in Canada, including the fact that 25% of people polled, and it was statistically relevant poll, now describe their political opponents as someone that they hate. We haven't seen that kind of vituperativeness in kind of ordinary Canadians' political discourse. And there are, obviously, multifactorial. But one of the things that gets very little truck right now is that the internet, right? The algorithmic logics that fuel the internet are all about getting you to click on it, right? And in order to do that, the algorithmic logics will always offer you as the next selection something that's just a little bit deeper, a little bit darker, a little bit richer than whenever you were going. So it pushes us to more and more extreme views. And so we see this as one of the elements of people, again, adopting an attitude of rage against the people who don't agree with them because, again, we're in silos, all those bubbles, all of those things. So kind of factoring in where new technologies have taken our very primitive brains. We're not very good at this, quite frankly. We think that, everybody thinks, Jonathan Haidt's work on this is really interesting, everybody thinks that they are a scientist. We will look at the evidence, and then we will see the truth. No. There's no evidence to support that. That's not what we do. We're lawyers. We have a moral intuition, and we cherry pick the evidence. And the more people tell us we're right, the more we know we're right. And then we're super right, and my God, we're so right that the other people are not wrong. They're evil. Right? They're evil. And that's the kind of discourse that starts to really feed upon itself, and we see more and more of it. And I'm going to hand this over to,
Briefly.
Go.
I just want to speak briefly, because when you're saying that, it makes me think of something. And I think, this is my analysis, I love to make theories. This one's probably wrong. But that the net has divided us, that there's, we all need technology. I'm not a Philistine or whatever the word is in that way, but but it's divided us so much, and it's divided communities. We need religion. I don't like organized religion, but people need to believe. They need to touch each other and wail and go through these amazing things and bang their chest and go, I believe. What I've seen around this is extremely religious. It's not rational. It's not thoughtful. People do not want to have a discussion. They do not want to appeal to religion. They want to feel connected. Deeply, deeply, deeply connected. I went, and it may sound totally strange, but my friend and I went to see this sort of RuPaul performance last night at the Orpheum. These are people who are divided. They're seeing the people they see online, watching in their rooms. They're watching RuPaul all alone with nobody. They get to go out in groups and meet each other and all go, yeah, as a group. This is something that used to be fundamental. We're community people. We need people. We need to look at each other and hug each other and cry with each other. These are the things we need all the time, constantly. It's human, right? So I would say, yeah, this is what's happening. It's fulfilling a gap, this kind of what I call victim politics. It's a very important people, but I don't agree with that's where it should go, but that's where it's gone.
Can I jump in
Yes.
from the left after?
You jump in, and then we have time for one more question before we call it a night. You have to go? Oh, you have to. You want? Oh, sure. Then you add something too. Okay, so Omari and then Morgane.
Well, I think one of the reasons why we're seeing such polarization is I don't remember a time where overt white supremacy and bigotry was so blatant, at least in my lifetime. And I think in terms of social media dividing us, I would disagree. If you want to look at things like, fourth wave feminism and the rise of like online activism, movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter couldn't have existed pre-internet. I think if there was Twitter and Facebook in 1950, we would have seen a lot more polarization than we were today. I assure you that black people who had to sit in the back of buses and drink from nasty water fountains were quite polarized in their opinions. So I just think it's a little bit. I think it's a little bit disingenuous to say that right now we're experiencing this newfound. I think what the difference is, oppressed people have a voice now that can be gathered as a collective because of things like hashtags and social media.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, yeah, Morgane, you want to say something?
So I operate quite a bit of my life in the world of organizing groups to try to protest something or to get a message across. And I'm horrified by how the people who feel oppressed are not just the people who I think of as oppressed, but it's actually everybody feels oppressed. The angry young man, the angry young white guy who's, yellow vest right now in Canada feels oppressed, feels wronged. And I am mindful of how trivially easy it is to organize an angry mob using social media with just a tiny bit of social engineering. And this is what really troubles me. And you see this with internet pylons on people when this mob is spontaneous. The power of the internet to get a message out and help us communicate our issue is also its weakness, because it is a self-polarizing tool that helps us filter and polarize a message. I am able to spend $30 and target people on social media by email, just knowing their email address, and they not know that I'm paying for them to see the message that they're getting, because Facebook allows this. It's trivial to do. And as we've all been learning recently in the last, let's say, 3 to 4 months, there's been an alarming amount of third-party messing around in our social movements, creating a little bit of instability. Some people seem to be thinking they're going to benefit from this. It's very worrisome to see how social media today is not only a tool for good, and it is, but it's also a powerfully destabilizing influence. And people demonizing. I have a lot of lived experience in this. Every once in a while I go and I stick my nose into the world that hates me. And I just kind of go say hello. And the scale of the vitriol is always it makes you blink a little bit. It's so powerful. People who truly, really in their heart of hearts think that I am the devil incarnate. And this is essentially from echo chamber type behavior, people who never leave their echo chamber of that issue that is reinforced by the algorithms in social media that trick us into thinking that we are the majority in whatever the issue is. But when that's aimed in a destructive way, a hateful, destructive way, those people still believe that God is on their side, to paraphrase the story. People really, truly believe on the whatever very, very edge of our society's mindsets, that they are the majority opinion. All they see all day is reinforcement of their belief system that I would call delusional, but they probably call my belief system delusional. So who knows where the compass is anymore? And this is really destructive. And you really see this in internet pylons on people, that it goes so much further than one would think it would go. And it can be very damaging.
Well, unfortunately, it's 9 o'clock. This is just clearly the very, very beginning of a very long and important conversation. It's the tip of the iceberg. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight, and most importantly, all these incredible panelists, Omari and Montreal, who donated their time tonight. So it has been filmed and it has been recorded for the radio. So once the film is up, I will be sharing it. There's a lot of people that wanted to come tonight that were not able to. So hopefully you guys will also pass it on once it's all shareable. Thanks again for coming.